Welcome to Pathways, a career podcast from the Idaho State University Career Center. I'm your host, Mark Bieber. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Jonathan Fardy, Assistant Professor of Art History, jointly appointed by the Art and History Departments at Idaho State University. Jonathan is one of the more prolific and visible professors here on Idaho State University's campus, but his path to get here is quite interesting and actually involves him leaving a promising career to change directions and pursue a career as a professor. Please sit back and enjoy our conversation with Dr. Jonathan Fardy. Hey, Jonathan, how you doing today?
Good, you?
I'm well, thank you. So, you're one of these people that when I first started working here, I swear I saw your name and picture probably weekly in Idaho State correspondences, whether it's a new book or a research award or something like that. And I also noticed you have a lot of titles under your name on an email. So could you tell us a little about what your job is here and how it is that you do everything?
Well, my job principally is to teach and research, which is true of any prof, I suppose. But specifically, I teach art history in the Department of Art, but I also have a joint appointment in the Department of History, so my courses are cross-listed with that department. How do I do everything? I will say I have a lot of support. I have a very supportive family and really supportive colleagues. So that and being able to close my door and get it into a tunnel vision mode and pound away on the keyboard kind of gets it done.
Yeah. But one of the things that I really noticed since working at Idaho State is I feel it's a very supportive community.
For sure, yeah.
This is the only university I've worked at, but I have felt that I get a lot of support to kind of do the things that I like to do.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I have very supportive colleagues who really have given me also, and I think this plays into why I've been able to do the writing projects, developing new courses, and so forth, is because my colleagues are supportive and they've really given me a good deal of freedom to take research or take teaching in the way that I think I want to go. And they've given me that kind of freedom to develop. So that I think is also really crucial in being able to do the work I do is really having supportive colleagues who give me that kind of freedom to experiment.
So what is that work that you like to do? So what part of your job do you get a lot of satisfaction out? Do you really love? And you were saying that you get a lot of support to do these things, and we've mentioned you have a couple books and some other projects. So what is it that you do on a day-to-day basis, and where do you find those things that you like to do?
I think that each aspect of my job, my teaching, research, and service, they all have aspects that I really enjoy about it. They're just different forms of enjoyment in some measure. When it comes to teaching, the thing that I love the most about it is it really is a thrill to convey ideas to students and also to have students respond, make me think about things or rethink things. And that's why I don't see the classroom time as disjointed or really separate from the research work I do alone in my office. To me, what happens in the classroom is there's a kind of collective project of thinking going on that's incredibly energizing for me and that directly fuels the writing that I do. I love discovery and I love discovering ideas, and I can do that and do that in partnership with students in the classroom and in my own private work as a researcher. And in terms of service, there's a number of committees I serve on in the university. And the thing I like about that is, for example, I serve on a research council. I get to meet professors working in different fields I know very little about, but I get to learn something about it through talking with them. So I've had really interesting discussions with people through that capacity in the sciences, for example. So it's just another opportunity to kind of learn and grow and get into dialogue with new ideas.
Yeah. Have you always found that to be something of interest to you throughout your life, that kind of like just kind of learning, discovering, growing?
I think so. I mean, I started as an art student. That's what I studied first in college.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found in that form of study was that, at least for me, was that art came to mean something like a place or practice in which you were rewarded for really drawing on as many different ideas and forms of making and thinking as you could. So for me, my education as an art student wasn't just about painting or sculpting. It was really about getting involved in a world of ideas as much as a world of materials and objects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has definitely continued throughout my circuitous career.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked about, we'll probably come back to that, some of what your art interests, but it seems like you have an interest, you at least had on your pathway an interest in more of the making piece of art. And now, as we've said, you write quite prolifically. These are all things that a lot of people try to find time for outside of their work as hobbies. Do you still do you keep those as hobbies, or is this all, or have you kind of worked this? Have you pursued this to work these into your life, or has this job allowed you to keep those as hobbies to some degree?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess yes. I guess I tried to. At some point, it dawned on me: why don't I try to put my life together career-wise in a way that will prioritize this thing that I love to do? I remember I was at a job in between my master's and my PhD program, and I went on lunch break, and I actually worked in a publishing company, but it happened to be right next to a museum, which I used to eat lunch at. And so I went to this museum to eat lunch, and I was reading a book of philosophy. And when I came back, an IT specialist who I worked with at the company said to me, he saw the book under my arm, and he said, something like, have you ever thought maybe that you're in the wrong line of work, or maybe you want to spend more time reading that book? And so, I think around that point I began to wonder about could I put a life together in which I got to do the things that really energized me.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
But I would say also, to your point about making, that, I mean, I've come to really think about, whether I was making art as an undergraduate or now I'm making books, being involved in the relationship between ideas and materials, whether that's the material of words or the material of plaster or what have you. That has sort of been there's been a continuity with that idea, bringing ideas and material together.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful way to kind of frame your thinking around art. I too was an art major in undergrad for a brief minute. I ended up with a minor.
Okay.
But for me, part of why I left that program was I had a hard time thinking about where I fit in. Like you're saying, that idea of materials. I was focusing on ceramics.
Okay.
But really what I was interested in is what you're talking about, kind of these connections. I was I always thought of myself as more of a conceptual artist. Like I liked kind of I liked things from Andy Kaufman. Like that's art to me, and music, and all the way down to tactile things like pottery and paintings and writing. But kind of connecting those pieces, and it just became hard for me to see how I was going to have a career, I guess. How I was going to, some of those like where the rubber hits the road ideas at some point, you start thinking, how am I going to be a ceramicist, and how many ceramicists in the world actually make money? How does it work? And that kind of scared me, and I backed out and took a different route. I guess as a professor in art and someone who studied that in undergrad, what are some different things you can do with an art major, or as an art major, what can you do to position yourself for success?
Yeah, I mean, I share those feelings that you've experienced too. I mean, I went to a liberal arts college basically and had a liberal arts education, but I majored in art. And as I got closer and closer to graduation, those concerns about what am I going to do with this began to grow bigger, and my parents were concerned. But I began to think about, again, maybe even as early as that, I began to think about, okay, maybe I don't really know, and I didn't know, how I would possibly make money, particularly because I was also, like you, really interested increasingly in very kind of conceptual, not exactly easily sellable things.
Yeah.
And so I wondered about how I was going to do this, and then I started to think. I actually found a book. I can't even remember the title. It was something like how to be a professional artist or something. And much of it didn't quite resonate with me. But one idea was at least try to find initially some kind of life balance between what you got to do to make money and giving yourself time to do the thing you love. That was the kind of solution I reached. And so I'd always liked teaching and being in the classroom, so I started to think about maybe some kind of education. And that turned into working with actually kids at an after-school program, which I did for a few years. And it was nice because I would do art projects with kids, which was fun, but it also gave me time in the mornings to do my work. And so for a while, that's how I kind of resolved that, was it may not all come in one package, but I can put together a life that enables me to do the thing I want to do. And that's sort of been a guiding thread for me.
Do you think to that end it would benefit an art student to look at possibly minors or other things that are almost like a more of a balance, almost like a business minor, or you're saying an education?
Absolutely. No. I actually minored in art history, so that's how that worked out. But certainly I did know of many students at the time who were doing minors in things like education, business, to give them another set of tools that they could use perhaps when they graduated. So I do think that that's useful. I also will say that after I graduated and I was working with kids and enjoying it, and I was actually meeting a lot of artists through that work, I also took advantage of actually a career day that was offered by a college in the area that I didn't attend, but I could go to. And it was a career day for recent graduates with art degrees.
Oh, wow.
And so, and that actually ended up being extremely helpful. I actually, it was through that I actually got a tip from somebody there who said, hey, this is an art magazine in Boston, and they're looking for someone to do copy editing. And I never really thought about journalism or art journalism, and I just thought it would maybe be kind of a cool way to spend some hours. And so that was something very directly that came out of that. It wasn't anything that the people that the present presenters were giving me. It was just somebody happened to be there, gave me a phone number to call.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's amazing what you can get out of something like networking or a career,
sure.
Even like a career fair. I know when I was young, I saw these as these necessary evils,
right?
Went into them with my, with a tight John armor on. But like you're saying, it's not all about just meeting that one person who has that one job you're interested in, but going in with that open mind, and that willingness to just kind of talk to people and kind of connect some dots that you might not even know are out there.
Absolutely, yeah. And I did kind of go into it with a tight jaw. I thought I was way too cool for that at the time. But as I say, had I not done that, I wouldn't have got that phone number. And it turned out that's what I started doing for a couple of years, was kind of working my way up in an art magazine. And so, yeah, I would definitely recommend, it's no harm in trying those kind of events. You might not get anything out of it, but you never know. So like you said, putting yourself out there, networking, whether it's through fairs or more informally, really important.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Dr. Jonathan Fardy, Assistant Professor of Art History at Idaho State University. So, Jonathan, it sounds like interest in art has been kind of a through line for you, going way back. Yeah. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I think I went through this sort of litany of most kids want to do things like astronaut or I think I've actually for a long time it's true. I really wanted to be a soldier of all things. I was fascinated by like soldier life or something. That waned, and the funny thing is I came from a family of teachers actually, and of course. In my 20s, I thought I would never be a teacher because everyone else was teachers in my family. But the art line or that through line about art does also have a kind of history. My grandfather was a painter and actually an art historian, although he had long since retired when I knew him. But it wasn't exactly an interest very early on, but it was something in the background. And my parents were wonderfully supportive, at least of the idea of art. They were they instilled in me an openness to it, more so with the musical arts. Actually, my father was very supportive of interest in music, although I had no natural talent in that regard. But so there was a kind of background anyway of an interest in the arts in the family, but there was also a concern to be practical and and so a little bit of both.
So when, for you, do you think that really started to kind of pick up? I mean, obviously it did before you went to college and declared it as a major. So did you start through high school or adolescence kind of becoming more and more interested in art?
Yeah, for sure.
And what directions specifically?
I mean, it will sound made up, but it's not. I can actually basically pin it to a very particular moment in the 8th grade when it was. I can only describe it as life transforming. It was. I had a tough time in the 8th grade. It was a difficult time in my life, but. The thing I really loved was art class and my art teacher. It was actually a place I felt safe and I felt accepted, and that was really important to me at that point. And I don't even remember her name, and it's kind of sad, but I remember this event in the class where she picked up and showed us a calendar containing reproductions of paintings by Henri Matisse. And she showed us one that I never forgot called The Tortoise. The snail, and it's a collage of just large shapes, and I was absolutely blown away by it, and I was unprepared to be blown away by it, and I'm really quite literally as soon as I got home, I went to the library to find out more about Matisse. What struck me was I remember her saying something, my art teacher saying something like, he made this very late in life when he was an old man. And what struck me as an 8th grader was I wanted to know why, after years and years of studying painting and practicing painting, did he think that he had sort of reached his pinnacle when he put down a few squares on a paper. That was sort of, that was just kind of mystifying to me in an interesting way. And so then it really picked up. I wanted to know more about Matisse, and I wanted to start making art. And I just kind of read my way through our local library. I read about Matisse, and Matisse led me to Picasso, and just sort of began to – so by the time I got to high school, the thing I loved was making art and reading about it, and particularly modern art. I'll say this too. It wasn't just making it that I found exhilarating. It was also reading about it, although I didn't think that would be my career. It was reading about it because it opened up it opened up a different world. I could as I read books about Matisse or Picasso, I could kind of imagine it could take me out of where I was, and I could imagine myself as sort of, what life would have been like in the turn of the 20th century in Paris. Yeah. And that seemed so much more interesting than the world that I was in. So partly it was just the way it opened the world for me. Yeah. That drew me in.
Still a bit of escapism.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And that there was something bigger than the world that I was in. Yeah. It felt bigger to me and felt more exciting. Yeah.
I had similar experiences. One, that period of kind kind of the Georges Braque and Picasso in Paris is like that's one of those things. Like if you could go back in a time in history, that's one of the times that I bring up. I just find it so interesting, the kind of confluence of characters, Hemingway and others, that we're all kind of moving around in that realm. But like yourself, I was also very drawn to the great artists, maybe even more so than making art. I took art classes the whole time just because I like to do it. And like you were saying, like art class was a little vacation for me in the middle of the day, right? Throughout, I mean, I love biology, I love English, but art class, you get to sit around with some friends and just make something. It is relaxing. But I never read about the artists. I'd look through books. I was always like I'd just be taken away by many different pictures. And it wasn't until my first art history class in my undergrad that I really started hearing those stories behind it all, and especially became intrigued by kind of like the Dada, and like the kind of the mayhem. I was also listening to a lot of like punk rock music at the time, and it all seemed to kind of like very well overlap. So when you went to college, did you have that understanding that were you that self-aware that you were interested in the kind of history of it, or how did you go into it? What were your goals going into that major?
So I have to say that by the time I was a senior in high school and I was like, okay, I have to go to college, I just kind of made a deal with my parents that I'll go. I wanted to go to an art school, and they were like, we're nervous about that. So the compromise was, okay, I'll go to a traditional college, but if I can major in art. And that was the sort of deal we struck. And then I did go with a sense that I wanted to learn more about the history, but I really felt like what I was an artist, or I was an artist in training, and it was kind of all bound up for me. I remember going once to one of my art history profs actually and saying to her, I spend a lot of time also enjoying reading about the history of art, the ideas around art, but I also love the studio. And am I supposed to decide? Like, am I supposed to do one or the other? And she gave me, her name was Dr. Perry, and Perry gave me good advice, which was, something like, don't worry about that. Just keep doing both. And she kind of gave me this idea that these are just different materials. And maybe at one point one's going to predominate in your practice, but for right now, just be involved in both. And that helped me. And also discovering other artists that were also writers and thinkers gave me a sense that was okay. And I didn't have to – so I ended up having an art history minor, and that seemed like a good compromise.
Yeah. I think that's such – good advice.
Yeah, it stuck with me.
Yeah, for all majors, really. I mean, I feel like so many students feel like they need to make this choice.
Yes,
and they need to pick a thing.
Yes.
Right now and go for it. But I mean, so much of kind of what we might suggest to students in career services is do things you're interested in.
Yes.
Find out, one of those things will rise to the top for you. And, if you like a couple things, keep doing them.
Yeah.
One might kind of start to rise to the top, or maybe you'll find how they just kind of meld together into one thing. So that's great that you had that advice at that time.
And I think that's a case in point, and something else I always encourage students is, mentorship, informally or formally, for me was huge, and really seeking out advice from people I trusted when I had those questions and I didn't know what to do with them. Ask people that you respect or who you think might be a kind of role model for you in a career. I think was helpful for me.
Was it difficult for you to make that outreach to those people?
I think early on in college it was. I think I was a little intimidated by profs. But later on in college, I got the sense that actually I was fortunate that a lot of these profs were really nice. And actually, as a prof now, I can tell you, if a student comes to me and says, hey, you know, I'm really interested in art. I have these questions. I'm not sure what to do with my career options, et cetera. That's something I'm going to be happy to, at least for me, I'm going to be happy to talk with a student. I can't imagine something that's more rewarding than talking with a student who's super interested in the thing that you're teaching.
Yeah.
So I think I would tell students, bear that in mind. If you're seeking out mentors, most people are going to be, pretty excited to actually talk about the field that they teach with someone who's interested in it.
It's incredible to kind of once you get over that hump of understanding that, and you go from that side of that intimidation, and they're so busy, they don't care about me. The imposter syndrome, maybe even once you're into like the higher levels or grad school. And then at some point in grad school or maybe right on the other side, you kind of get to that point where like, oh, everyone here is just excited about what they're doing.
Yeah,
and,
right.
If they can, like you were saying, if you're showing interest in something they're interested in, what's more, what is more fun for them to then be able to share that?
Yeah, that's been my experience for sure. Yeah.
That's awesome. So after you graduated, you said, did you go straight into a master's?
Nope.
You kind of talked about a couple.
Yeah, I worked for a couple of years. Actually, 4 years I worked with kids, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders in an after-school program. And I worked as an artist. I mean, I was showing in exhibitions. And then I got this tip this art magazine needed a copy editor. And so then I started dividing my mornings. I would work for a few hours at the magazine. And then I would hop on the T and go down to work with the after-school program. And it was in that moment, working at the art magazine, that I finally saw somebody, namely my editor, who had he actually was nice. He gave me a shot at writing a column, and that went well. And I never thought of myself as somebody who would be good at writing about art. And again, it was sort of a mentor. And here was a guy who had, who I looked up to immensely, probably even more than any professor I had, was the editor at that magazine. And he happened to have a PhD in, of all things, psycholinguistics. But anyway, it was somebody I could look to and say, he has this thing called PhD. He was also and is a poet and a novelist, or a playwright rather. And so he seemed like a kind of model at that point for me, or a role model. And that's when I started thinking seriously that, hey, maybe it's actually not so much making art, but it's this business of writing about it. And maybe that's going to be linked up with going to get a PhD. But it was very much because I had this kind of mentorship with an editor. And I could see, hey, maybe I could follow a similar path.
Yeah.
And that's what led me to go get an MA in art history. And I will say about that something happened, though, in my MA, and this is why my path is, again, really kind of circuitous. So I get into this MA program. I'm like, great, I'm going to do art history. And what I found was that my preparation in art journalism was good, but that the kind of writing that you do in the academy is very different when it comes to writing about art. And there was a kind of plus and minus to this from my experience of it. I got involved as a master's student precisely in something called like art theory, which from my standpoint at that time felt like maybe magazine criticism on steroids, like really argumentatively tight, well-sourced, et cetera. And I think I wasn't actually very good at it because it was a different kind of language, but I was fascinated by it. So it felt a little bit like I'd been thrown in the deep end, but I was kind of enjoying the process of learning to swim in it. So came out of there and I took some time off again, and I worked actually in publishing again. And then finally, probably around that time, that IT guy was like, hey, why don't you spend more time reading books than doing this? And so that's when I decided to go get a PhD.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think that's so good to hear that you were in a career. You were in. I mean, it seemed like you're in a publishing career. It probably has good outlook for a lot of people who stick with it.
Right. I was very fortunate.
Right. And then, and then making that shift to an MA, and then once again, having those kind of realizations, but also like so good on you for being open to whenever those, like just those little things, right? Those the serendipity of the IT guy saying something
exactly.
and digging into the deep end of it.
I've tried to. I remember all this because I try to make an effort to keep track of why I ended up where I am. In part because that actually helps me do my work. Part of my process in writing books is tracking not only what I'm interested in, but like what brought me into that interest. Because sometimes it's around the interest on the periphery that there's something more interesting going on. So, just thinking about those kind of little moments, it's, again, sometimes there's little moments that actually add up to the larger story. At least that's been my experience. But then as a doctoral student, I think that's when I felt like I really began to come into my own. And I began to really see myself, not just in a kind of fantastical way, but in a more practical way. I could begin to think of myself as getting ready for a career as a professor. That's when I really felt very consciously committed to that end goal. It just felt like at that point I was just at that moment where I could kind of put the pieces mentally together and see it that way.
You kind of finally made that step into feeling comfortable with the future. So for all of our listeners out there, students, career seekers, looking for their own, hoping for themselves to kind of start getting to that place where they're feeling comfortable or finding what they're truly interested in. Do you have any words of advice for them on their path?
I'm going to probably say some things that will sound kind of cliche, but they're sincere. And that is really that try to honor your own interests. I think that there's so much pressure on students to, they're going to get pulled and pushed in different ways, and people are going to say you should do X or Y because that's more practical. Take advice. Think about it, but weigh it against your own sense of how do you want to spend your time? And because the truth is that, a job is something that's going to eat up a lot of your time, no matter what it is. And so it's a really big decision and not one I think to be taken lightly about how do you want to spend that time? And so, my advice to students is take seriously your own interests, and try to think about answering this question from a standpoint that sort of honors that interest and doesn't immediately sideline it for something quote unquote more practical. I have nothing against practical career options. We have to survive, and that's important. But I think we also have to, or I would want students to honor those interests, because at least the role models that I've been fortunate enough to have in my life are all people, or most of them are people whose decisions were made from that standpoint, it seems to me. It was made from the standpoint of how do I want to spend my time? Honoring, cultivating a sincere interest, or sidelining that for something I think I'm supposed to do. So I don't know if that's advice but that's my sense of
that's beautiful.
My sense of things.
I love it. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Jonathan.
My pleasure.
And that was our conversation with Dr. Jonathan Fardy. I love how Jonathan was always open to those little moments, from mentors to random people at work. But I also find it extremely interesting how he's always engaged in a reflective process about how he got to here, unpacking it, putting it back together to build a better perspective about how he wants to move forward. Something I think everyone should be engaging in along their pathway for both their personal life and their career life. If you have any questions about your career pathway, please feel free to reach out to the Idaho State University Career Center at isu.edu/career. You can also look for new Pathways episodes weekly at kisu.org/pathway or on Spotify. Likewise, you can catch us the second Wednesday of every month at 7:30 p.m. on KISU. From Pathways and the Idaho State University Career Center, I'm Mark Beaver, wishing you a fantastic rest of your day.